Hey everybody, it's me, Omegon, and I'm going to be doing a little short off-the-cuff lore video here as a request from the artist who made my very nice new background, as you can see here, among some of the other things that he wanted me to cover real quick as I can afford to right now. But I'm probably going to be doing more expansive content on all this stuff later if I can both find the time and all the information on it. So let's talk about the Hrud. The Hrud, there's not actually a lot of information about them as I've been finding out, at least not a lot of like substantial information that hasn't been corrupted by like 6th edition and onward canon that basically was there to kind of soft squat them. They've been around since Rogue Trader, like 1st edition 40k. Though when they were there, they were kind of kept in the shadow. The concept for them was that they were going to just be Skaven in space, which honestly would have been kind of cool. But as it turns out, like what they ended up being is actually a lot cooler, despite the fact that they have not that much information. So aside from like some sources in 1st through 3rd edition that kind of reference them offhand, really, the majority of the information came about around 4th edition in 2006 in Xenology, which there's some people that will declare Xenology is not canon. There's a lot of people that will declare that like that Xenology was declared not canon, and people want to ignore it and everything, but it's a very, very good background book, and I'm absolutely sure any official elements of GW that have tried to, like, you know, memory hole that book existing are probably just trying to, once again, memory hole all of the work of Simon Spurrier, and it's not actually to do with the content of the book itself. As far as the Hrud go in Xenology as an overview, well, a lot of what they are in Xenology is more like a fleshing out of information that was around about them from 1st through 3rd edition. 1st edition, they were kind of the Skaven because they had like referential models that were like Skaven models but with cloaks and like warp rifles instead of just swords. But there was next to nothing really about them other than just they lived in warrens, they were underground, weird trash monsters, and they were like, they feasted on garbage and they hid in the sewers and the caves of horrible places, and they lived in the shadows. And then Xenology came out and really fleshed them out as like their own thing. And not only that, but it provided a lot of the artwork where they went from being like, you know, possibly rat men in cloaks to giant weird reptilian vertebrae monsters, where they have a rapidly decaying they have a rapidly decaying, like, nearly liquid organ system and soft tissues surrounded by like hard tissues of scales and bone plates that are almost all made up of like calcified garbage that they collect on their skin. And they have the key feature of them was that all of their limbs were not actually like hard bones so much as or like hard singular bones arranged in the form of limbs that could move and abduct and subduct, so much as they were like sets of vertebrae that could, through muscular action, harden into single columns or separate back, so they could just squid monster their way around. And a cool thing to note about about like some of the anatomy of them that they noted in Xenology was they were apparently, their biosystems were apparently compatible with human bionics with some tinkering. They often would hoard Eldar artifacts a lot, and they could use Dark Eldar weapons. Like in Xenology, for instance, they believed they had access to, they were like the weapons that they found. One of the subjects that was vivisected or dissected in the book, rather, was one that had like a weapon that looked like it could have been a Dark Eldar agonizer based on the findings of the Magos and the Inquisitor in the book. And we're like, why would they have one of these? This is like a really advanced weapon. Then again, this book was also written way before the 5th edition Dark Eldar Codex came out, that really like expanded upon them and how their society works. But that's neither here nor there. As far as historically they go, the Hrud, and I'll get back to their biology in a second because this will affect it, but they're historically, the way that they always were in 40k was that they didn't organize as an army. They didn't show up in a war force. They were more like like the Imperium treated them like gigantic nests of hobos that needed to be cleared out, which is basically what they were. They're horrible trash monsters that live underground and feast on garbage. Like, they apparently thermoregulate by, like, they have an extremely advanced thermoregulation where, like, they excrete toxins through their skin and bind with other toxins and everything to do that. But as far as they go for the Imperial history and how that resolves was, they wouldn't have war bands, they wouldn't have armies, they would have these things called migrations, where like millions to billions of them as a single unit would move across the galaxy in like this religious fervor and go, hey, we need to leave this planet, it's time to go because somebody in our religious order or our gods or whatever, it's never been expanded upon, says we gotta go. And these events were so great that, like, in the later fluff, entire Space Marine chapters get wiped out, like whole civilization, like micro civilizations of the Imperium get wiped out, like entire systems and planets and battle fleets and everything when this happens. And like, funnily enough, in the established fluff before 6th edition, the enemies that had to deal with them the most often, the people that like had to, as far as humans had to deal with them the most often, were the Iron Warriors during the Great Crusade. And then after that, like the Ultramarines. And the Iron Warriors had to deal with the horrible trash monsters that decay everything they touch. And as decaying everything they touch, a big thing about the Hrud from earlier editions, especially is not really established in Xenology, but a thing that like they had hinted at a lot of the time was that the Hrud did actually have their own technology, but they would scavenge from everybody else, and they were so technologically competent that they would just, as I mentioned before with bionics and agonizers and everything, they could use stuff that other civilizations had made perfectly competently. When they made their totally own stuff, they had these things called warp plasma fusels. So which are never really expanded on either. It's assumed that they generate plasma through warp methods or something, or fire like warp energy at you, which would be even crazier. And as far as the rest of their biology goes and why they were such a threat and they're so considered so toxic, wasn't just that they're like poisonous and venomous and they actively make the atmosphere dark and shadowy and covered in like toxic miasma everywhere, but it was implied for a long time that in some places outright stated that I have to find sources for, but it was implied for a long time, and it was known kind of in like the fan canon of 40k that they produced these bubbles of entropy, like chronological entropy, like they would accelerate the entropy of matter and energy around you, and the fields would get larger, like how orcs have a Gestalt psychic field that makes their technology not suck. Hrud had a Gestalt psychic field where around them everything would age and crumble faster than it normally would. And a big part of this was there was a long-running fan theory that had to do with how, like, the earlier editions of the Tau, for the 3rd and 4th edition eras of Tau, based on their codex, they were very open to alien races. Like, the Tau Empire was open to even orcs joining the Empire prior to 5th and 6th edition. Mostly 6th edition canon. And so it was without saying that they would probably be welcoming the Hrud. So a theory about why the Tau inexplicably had such short lifespans, in the sense that, the Tau were very close to humans, but for some reason, despite having superior medical technology en masse, for whatever reason, their max lifespan for most of the Tau was like 40 years, which is it was never really explained. And they always made reference to it with how, like, old Farsight was, and then they had to, like, retcon some of the stuff later on where they said, like, oh yeah, all their special characters have to keep being cryogenically frozen and stuff so we can, because if you live past the age of, like, 35 as a Firecast, that's like, you're about to get cancer. Which also, the Tau have a lot of implications with radiation poisoning in their culture and everything, but that's neither here nor there. As far as the Hrud go, though, is that the theory was, for a long, long time, or at least on forums and in very shadowy places where the Imperium and the light of GW did not want players to go. The theory goes that Hrud, being an alien race that was more or less peaceful and welcome in the Tau Empire, would set up warrens underneath a lot of the Tau cities, and their chronological chronological accelerating entropy fields or whatever, however you would word it, basically were sapping the life force and aging everybody in Tau colonies, and that was why all the Tau were dying so early and everything all the time. And it was a really cool theory, not only because it kind of explained why like the Tau just inexplicably would die so young, but also it was a cool grimdark thing where it poked fun in an in-universe way at how open and nice the Tau seemed to be for the first few editions, at least on their face, even though I argue that they never really were all that nice. And, you know, like they were always kind of sort of grimdark in an implicit way, and just people didn't like subtlety, because this is 40K, so they demanded that they demanded that they had to be much, much more grimdark than they actually were. Or at least, like, more overtly, rather. But as far as the Hrud go, like, yeah, so as established in like the common, I guess like the common lore of 40K, rather, it's they're weird toxic trash monsters. They accelerate entropy. They move in galaxy-shaking migrations that have destroyed like entire civilizations overnight, and they're inexplicably peaceful. And they're strange and shadowy. And as established by xenology, one of the coolest things about them is that it's implied that they're one of the races that the old ones created, and they may have fought during the war in heaven. And some inquisitors in the lore have noted that they have their pantheon is incredibly similar to the Eldar's pantheon. Like, they have the same archetype of all the same gods. They seem to be as old as the Eldar, though nobody can tell because they rot immediately when they die, so it's really hard to, like, date them. Date any of their tissues or bodies. And then one of the main things is that they're, despite the fact that they have a pantheon similar to the Eldar and the Eldar's pantheon, with, like, debatably Aisha is still alive, and then Kane is still alive to an extent, and Shegarach is alive to an extent. They don't actually care about any of those deities. They worship a god called Qua, which also in xenology they established the Umbra, which was a monster, like a random space monster from first edition that could like manipulate darkness. They would hang out in void ships and like near the plasma generators and the warp drives and everything, and they were like viewed as pests, but they're just strange alien like dark matter monsters, so nobody really fucked with them. And they were like, believe they were in Rogue Trader in first edition, or they were at least part in second edition, because they existed before xenology came out, and then xenology expanded upon them. And the theory goes is that like the primary god for the Hrud was actually Qua, who like informed a lot of their culture and everything. And Qua may have been one of the Eldar gods that was shattered by Slaanesh and torn to a million pieces in their lore. And so the theory goes is that like the million pieces of Qua, or the deity that the Hrud call Qua, is actually the Umbra. So it makes sense, because they're like a lot of their civilization and their culture in general, as far as like what little has ever been written about the Hrud, is based entirely on like slinking around the shadows, hiding and consuming garbage and scavenging and like staying away from the light and everything, until like they have some kind of, you know, apocalyptic like Ragnarok event in their mythology, where they're going to come back together. They're all going to get together, and their god's going to put itself back together and then go fight this thing in their mythology that might be a reference to Slaanesh, which also might be a reference to Yniad, but Yniad is fucking stupid. That's just the off the cuff thing. I'll probably use this as an entrance piece to any additional lore video I do on the Hrud. That'll be obviously much better research, much better cited. The issue is a lot of the Hrud lore, the bulk of it shows up in background books and novels that are either no longer in print, considered not canon by a lot of people, and hard to find even on the internet, or not exactly hard to find, but like hard to get like decent copies of, and or just stuff that like GW is basically declared non-canon, or is like retconned into the ground. And you can see this by even like looking at their own references. If you go to any wiki, like just regular Wikipedia, 1D4chan, Lexicanum, like the 40k wiki, if you look up lore channels, almost all the information they have on the Hrud is based on citations from 6th edition and onward. And in my opinion, like, GW stopped really giving a shit about anything that wasn't like directly translatable to model sales, like lore-wise, around the time of like 5th edition and onward. So most of it is just random, like, you know, background information about battles that happened between some random Space Marine unit and some Hrud migration, or something that happened during the Horus Heresy that was also a background event from like those books. Not anything that's actually like substantial about the Hrud themselves as an alien species. So, I mean, on one hand, that's kind of a good thing if you think of the whole principle of your dudes, or you think of the principle of it as a GM who tries to like care about these kinds of things when he's making a campaign with, like, say, the Fantasy Flight RPGs or something, where you have a ton of room to work with the Hrud and a lot of stuff, but ultimately, like, you know, it's more busy work for you and more fan fiction and headcanon nonsense, and it gets into debates and arguments. And I'm sure I'm going to be guilty of some stuff like that myself, but I like to at least try to like base a lot of like what I do as far as like my theories and my ideas on like the established canon that was at least established by people that seem to have cared and weren't doing this because of marketing. And in that regard, I'm going to be, in the future, when I have time and I can, I'm going to be hopefully finding some more information on the Hrud, find some more information about their culture, their weapons, how they would fight, how they would live, who they interact with, their allies, maybe like get some homebrew on making them playable in like a Tau Empire game or something like that, because I have some old rules like that laying around from forever ago from a failed campaign. As far as that goes, I'm probably going to search main canon sources and give Xenology another few read-throughs and like snip out what I can. Obviously, I'm going to be getting some pictures for this video from that book, if not other sources. Although there's a lot of really good fan art out there of some stuff, because you know, a lot of 40k fans have gotten better at art, and GW has gotten worse at it apparently. And as far as that goes, I'm definitely going to be looking into some of the older, like out of print, like Fantasy Flight Games books, and like Dark Heresy 1.0, Death Watch, that sort of thing, and see if they have any more references to the Hrud in there, because that stuff is still considered pseudo-canon, and Fantasy Flight Games, like, you know, they're not always fantastic, but they came at everything from an RPG angle and not a sell models angle. So when they were writing a lot of the stuff for 40k for any of the RPG content, it's actually really well written for the most part. So yeah, hopefully this doesn't rub you the wrong way, and thank you again, random Alphonse Legionés, Mr. Artist Man, for making this background for me. I hope this satisfies you.